I'm Edward, 75 years old, retired engineer with 35 years of experience. 10 years ago, I thought retirement would be my reward. Instead, it became my biggest mistake. I wasted 8 precious years, and I'm here to make sure you don't. What I'm about to tell you will change how you think about your golden years forever. For 35 years, I lived and breathed structural engineering. My name was on blueprints for office buildings, shopping centers, and apartment complexes across 3 states. I started as a junior engineer fresh out of college, carrying coffee and checking calculations for senior partners. By my 50s, I was the senior partner, the one younger engineers looked up to, the man whose approval could make or break a project. I remember the pride I felt walking past buildings I had helped design. There was the Morrison Shopping Center, where my innovative beam design saved the company $50,000. The Riverside Apartments, where my foundation calculations prevented what could have been a catastrophic settling issue. Every structure stood as a monument to my expertise, my dedication, my worth. My colleagues respected me. When complex problems arose, they came to my office. When clients had concerns, they requested me specifically. I worked 60-hour weeks without complaint because work never felt like work. It felt like purpose. It felt like identity. I was Edward the engineer, and that title meant everything. At home, I was equally defined by my professional success. My wife of 45 years supported every late night, every weekend project, every work dinner that ran past 9 o'clock. She understood that my career was not just what I did, it was who I was. Our son followed my work ethic, becoming a successful accountant in California. Our daughter inherited my attention to detail, excelling as a nurse practitioner. My brother, also in construction, and I would spend family gatherings discussing industry trends and sharing war stories from job sites. Financially, I was meticulous. Every paycheck was divided between living expenses, savings, and retirement contributions. I maximized my 401k, invested wisely, and paid off our mortgage 15 years early. I attended company financial planning seminars and met with advisors annually. By age 60, I had accumulated enough wealth to retire comfortably at 70. By 65, I could have retired with luxury. My reputation in the community reflected my professional standing. I served on the City Planning Commission, consulted on municipal building projects, and mentored engineering students at the local university. People introduced me as Edward, the engineer who designed half the buildings downtown. That introduction never got old. When I imagined retirement, I saw peaceful mornings with coffee and newspapers. I pictured traveling with my wife to places we had only talked about visiting. I envisioned finally reading all those books stacked on my nightstand, finally learning to play guitar, finally having time for long conversations with my grandson about life beyond homework and video games. I was confident in my ability to handle retirement the same way I handled complex engineering challenges. Break it down into manageable components, apply proven principles, execute with precision. How hard could it be? I had successfully managed million-dollar projects, led teams of dozens, solved problems that stumped other professionals. Retirement would simply be another project to master. Picture your own retirement dreams right now. I guarantee they look a lot like mine did. You probably see yourself finally having time for hobbies you have postponed. You imagine deeper relationships with family members who have taken second place to career demands. You envision days structured around your preferences rather than external obligations. You think about the relief of never again setting an alarm clock or sitting through another pointless meeting. I thought my decades of problem-solving experience would translate seamlessly to creating a fulfilling post-career life. I believed that financial preparation was retirement preparation. I assumed that someone who could design structures to withstand earthquakes could certainly design a daily routine to withstand boredom. My confidence was absolute. Other people struggled with retirement because they lacked my planning skills, my discipline, my clear thinking under pressure. Other people failed to prepare properly or had unrealistic expectations. I would be different. I would succeed at retirement the way I had succeeded at everything else. The engineering projects that had filled my days for 35 years were more than tasks to complete. They were puzzles that engaged my mind, challenges that proved my competence, contributions that mattered to the world. Every problem solved reinforced my sense of value. Every successful project launch validated my existence. Every client satisfaction letter confirmed my purpose. I never questioned what would happen when those projects disappeared. I never considered how I would replace the intellectual stimulation, the professional validation, the sense of necessity that work provided. I never thought about who I would be when I was no longer Edward the engineer. Looking back now, I realize I was like a machine calibrated for one specific function, with no understanding of what would happen when someone finally decided to pull the plug. But at the time, I felt prepared for anything retirement could throw at me. I had solved far more complex problems than figuring out how to spend my golden years productively and happily. The warning signs were everywhere, but I was too arrogant to see them. 3 years before my accident, my colleague Johnson retired with great fanfare. The company threw him a party, presented him with a gold watch, and everyone spoke about his well-deserved rest. 6 months. Later, I ran into his wife at the grocery store. She looked exhausted. When I asked about Johnson, she just shook her head and said he was struggling to find his place. I dismissed it as Johnson's personal weakness. He had always been less organized than me, less disciplined. That would never happen to someone like me. My father-in-law had retired from his accounting firm 5 years earlier. During family dinners, I watched him grow quieter and more withdrawn each visit. He would sit in his chair, staring out the window, while conversations flowed around him. My wife would whisper her concerns to me later, saying he seemed lost without his office routine. I nodded sympathetically, but privately thought he simply lacked imagination. If I had his free time, I would find a dozen productive ways to fill it. Even my wife tried to warn me, though I did not recognize her words as warnings at the time. She would occasionally suggest I develop hobbies outside of work, maybe join a book club or take up woodworking. When I brushed off these suggestions, saying work kept me plenty busy, she would get a worried look in her eyes. She pointed out that most of our social life revolved around my colleagues and work events. She wondered aloud what we would do for social connection when I retired. I told her we would make new friends, as if friendship was another engineering project I could tackle when the time came. The truth was, I had no interest outside of work. My idea of relaxation was reading engineering journals. My hobbies were work-related conferences and professional development seminars. When forced to take vacations, I spent them visiting construction sites in other cities, marveling at innovative building techniques. I told myself I was passionate about my field, but really I was afraid to discover who I might be without it. My social circle consisted entirely of people I knew through work. My conversations with my brother centered on construction industry trends and shared professional experiences. My friendships with other men in the neighborhood were cordial but shallow, based on occasional barbecues and discussions about property values rather than real intimacy. I had no idea how to build relationships that were not anchored by professional common ground. Even my family relationships suffered from my narrow focus. When my son called to discuss problems in his marriage, I found myself offering advice, as if relationship issues were structural engineering problems that could be solved with proper analysis and systematic approaches. When my daughter wanted to talk about her struggles balancing motherhood and career, I would inevitably steer the conversation toward the practical aspects of her job rather than the emotional challenges she was facing. My grandson was 8 years old and full of curiosity about everything except engineering. He wanted to show me his drawings, his rock collection, his elaborate stories about imaginary adventures. I would nod politely and then try to interest him in how buildings were constructed or bridges were designed. I could see his enthusiasm fade when I redirected his interests toward mine. Even an 8-year-old could sense that I only knew how to connect through my professional lens. My daily routine was entirely structured around work demands. I woke at the same time every weekday, followed the same morning routine, drove the same route to the office. My sense of time was organized around project deadlines, client meetings, and construction schedules. Weekends were for catching up on work reading and preparing for the upcoming week. I had no practice at creating structure from internal motivation rather than external demands. Physically, I was declining without realizing it. Decades of desk work had left me with poor posture, weak muscles, and no cardiovascular fitness. I told myself I was too busy for exercise, that physical labor on job sites provided enough activity. My wife suggested we take evening walks together, but I usually had reports to review or calls to return. My doctor mentioned during annual checkups that I should increase my activity level, but his recommendations seemed less urgent than project deadlines. The most dangerous blind spot was my complete lack of psychological preparation for retirement. I spent more time researching which contractor to hire for minor home repairs than I spent thinking about how I would structure my days without work. I researched investment strategies extensively, but never researched what made retirement fulfilling versus miserable. I had detailed financial projections for the next 20 years, but no emotional projections at all. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself honestly, what would you do if your work identity disappeared tomorrow? I thought I knew the answer to that question, but I had never seriously examined it. I assumed retirement would be like an extended vacation, refreshing and energizing. I never considered that vacation is only refreshing because you know you will return to your regular life afterward. I was like a man who had spent 35 years becoming an expert at one instrument, believing that mastery of that instrument qualified me to conduct an entire orchestra. When retirement finally arrived, I discovered I had no idea how to make music with the rest of my life. October 5th, 2003. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. I had been called to inspect a renovation project at the old Hartwell Manufacturing Building downtown. It should have been routine. I had done hundreds of similar inspections over the decades. The contractor needed approval to remove a load-bearing wall on the third floor, and my calculations indicated it could be done safely with proper reinforcement. I arrived at the site that Tuesday morning feeling confident and competent. The weather was crisp, autumn leaves crunching under my feet as I walked from the parking lot. I remember thinking it was a perfect day for field work, a nice break from office paperwork. I greeted the construction foreman, reviewed the plans one more time, and climbed the temporary stairs to examine the area in question. What I had not accounted for was the age of the building and the deterioration of materials I could not see. The building had been constructed in 1952, and over 50 years of settling, weather, and previous modifications had weakened the structure in ways that were not apparent from the blueprints. When the workers began removing sections of the wall I had approved, the ceiling above began to sag ominously. I should have ordered an immediate evacuation. I should have trusted my instincts when I heard the first cracking sound. Instead, I stepped closer to examine what was happening, trying to assess the severity of the situation. I was still thinking like an engineer, analyzing the problem, when I should have been thinking like a human being in danger. The collapse happened in slow motion and instantly at the same time. A section of the ceiling, weakened by decades of water damage I had not detected, gave way. Chunks of concrete and twisted metal rained down. I remember the sound like thunder trapped in a small room. I remember the dust cloud that made breathing impossible. I remember the moment of weightlessness before something heavy struck my back and drove me to the floor. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced, not just physical pain, though that was excruciating, but the pain of professional failure. In 30 seconds, everything I thought I knew about myself crumbled along with that ceiling. The engineer who had never made a serious miscalculation had just made one that could have killed people. The man who prided himself on careful analysis had missed critical details that led to disaster. The construction workers pulled me from the rubble. The foreman, a man I had worked with on 3 previous projects, kept saying it was not my fault, that these old buildings were unpredictable, but I knew better. I had missed something. I had failed at the one thing I was supposed to be expert at. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of physical pain and professional shame. My injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. 3 cracked ribs, a severe back injury that would require months of physical therapy, and a concussion that left me dizzy and disoriented for weeks. But the psychological injury was far worse. I lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had gotten it so wrong. My confidence, built over 35 years of successful projects, was shattered as completely as the concrete that had fallen on me. My wife barely left my side during the 5-day hospital stay. She held my hand while doctors explained the extent of my injuries, the long recovery process, the likelihood of chronic back pain. She managed phone calls from concerned colleagues and family members. She dealt with insurance companies and hospital paperwork while I lay there, trapped in my own thoughts about professional failure. The company's response was swift and, they claimed, generous. The legal department arrived within 48 hours, not to blame me, but to protect both me and the firm from lawsuits. They assured me that these accidents happened, that I was a valued employee, that my decades of excellent work spoke for themselves. But I could see the concern in their eyes. A structural engineer who had been involved in a building collapse, even through no clear fault of his own, was a liability. Within a week, they offered me an early retirement package that was too good to refuse. Full pension benefits, enhanced health insurance, and a settlement that would ensure financial security for the rest of my life. They called it generous recognition of my years of service. I called it a golden parachute designed to get me away from any potential legal complications. The message was clear. My career was over, even if no one wanted to say it directly. The doctors were equally direct about my physical limitations. The back injury meant no more climbing construction site stairs, no more long days bent over drafting tables, no more of the physical demands that field work required. Combined with the concussion effects that left me struggling with concentration and memory, I was no longer capable of the work that had defined me for 35 years. In 30 seconds, everything I thought I knew about myself crumbled. The competent professional became a liability. The healthy, capable man became someone with chronic pain and cognitive limitations. The person whose identity was built on being useful and productive became someone who needed care and assistance. They called it early retirement, but it felt like exile. Everyone kept congratulating me on my good fortune, the wonderful opportunity to enjoy my golden years, earlier than planned. But I felt like I was attending my own funeral, listening to people praise a life that had just ended in the most humiliating way possible. Those first few months felt like an extended vacation. I should have known vacations always end. For the first time in decades, I woke up without an alarm clock. I would lie in bed, listening to my wife's gentle breathing, watching sunlight creep across the ceiling, marveling at the luxury of having nowhere urgent to be. The absence of work stress felt like a physical weight lifted from my shoulders. My wife and I rediscovered the pleasure of leisurely breakfast together. We would sit at the kitchen table for an hour, sharing sections of the newspaper, discussing articles we had never had time to read thoroughly. She seemed genuinely happy to have me home, making my favorite meals and suggesting small projects we could tackle together. We organized closets that had been neglected for years, sorted through boxes of old photographs, and finally painted the guest bedroom. I threw myself into home improvement with the same intensity I had once applied to professional projects. I built custom shelving for the garage, reorganized my workshop, and researched the best methods for refinishing the hardwood floors. These projects gave me a sense of accomplishment and productivity. I told myself I was simply redirecting my problem-solving skills toward domestic challenges. During this honeymoon phase, I actually enjoyed telling people I was retired. At the grocery store, the bank, social gatherings, I would announce my new status with pride. People would congratulate me, express envy about my freedom, and I would smile knowingly, feeling like I had won some kind of life lottery. I had escaped the rat race while others were still trapped in their cubicles and meeting rooms. But by the 4th month, something started to shift. The home projects were finished, and I found myself struggling to fill the long hours between breakfast and dinner. I would walk through the house looking for tasks that needed attention, but everything was organized, repaired, and optimized. The sense of purpose that had sustained me during the early projects began to evaporate. My sleep patterns became irregular. Without the structure of work deadlines, my body seemed confused about when to be alert and when to rest. I would stay up late watching television shows I had no real interest in, then sleep until 10 in the morning, feeling groggy and disoriented. My wife would already be up, dressed, and productive while I shuffled around in my bathrobe, trying to decide how to spend another empty day. The restlessness manifested as irritability. Small things began to annoy me intensely. The neighbor's dog barking, traffic noise from the street, even my wife's cheerful morning energy felt intrusive. I snapped at her over trivial matters, then felt guilty about my unreasonable reactions. She would look at me with concern and confusion, trying to understand why retirement was making me angry instead of happy. The first major crack in my retirement facade appeared when former colleagues stopped calling. Initially, several work friends had reached out, expressing concern about my accident and congratulating me on my retirement. But when I failed to return their calls promptly, when I declined invitations to company social events, when I made it clear that I wanted to distance myself from my former professional life, they gradually stopped trying to maintain contact. My pride prevented me from admitting that I missed those connections desperately. I told myself that I was moving on, that clinging to work relationships would prevent me from embracing my new life. But the truth was, I was embarrassed about the circumstances of my retirement. I could not bear the thought of facing former colleagues who might pity me or question my professional competence. I thought they would chase me, but why? Would they? I had made myself irrelevant. The isolation was compounded by my growing obsession with reliving past professional achievements. Without new challenges to occupy my mind, I found myself constantly revisiting successful projects from my career. At family dinners, I would dominate conversations with detailed stories about complex engineering problems I had solved years earlier. I would describe the Morrison Shopping Center project for the third time, explaining again how my innovative beam design had saved $50,000. My family's patience began to wear thin. I could see their eyes glaze over when I launched into another work anecdote. My son would politely listen but steer the conversation toward current events or family news. My daughter would nod and smile but change the subject as quickly as possible. During one family gathering, my 8-year-old grandson innocently asked, "Grandpa, do you know any stories that aren't about work?" The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized the answer was no. My wife's growing concern became impossible to ignore. She would watch me pace around the house, searching for something to do and suggest activities I might enjoy. Why didn't I try the community center's woodworking class? What about volunteering at the library? Maybe I could audit a course at the local college. I rejected every suggestion with increasing irritation. Those activities seemed beneath someone of my professional stature and intellectual capacity. The physical decline was equally insidious. Without the structure of workday routines, I abandoned the minimal exercise habits I had maintained during my career. I stopped taking the stairs when elevators were available, stopped parking farther away from store entrances, stopped doing the basic stretches my doctor had recommended for my back injury. My body began to feel foreign and unreliable. My eating patterns deteriorated along with everything else. Instead of regular meal times dictated by work schedules, I began snacking constantly and eating irregular, unhealthy meals. My wife would prepare nutritious dinners, but I would often spoil my appetite with chips, cookies, and other comfort foods throughout the day. When my daughter commented during a visit that I looked like I had gained weight, I became defensive and angry. "It's like you retired from life, not just work." Those words from my wife haunted me because I could not argue with their accuracy. I treated my body like a rental car I was about to return with no concern for its long-term condition. I became a professional time waster, and I was very good at it. By my 8th year of retirement, I had become a ghost in my own life. The man who once solved complex engineering problems could not figure out how to fill a single day meaningfully. I would wake up around 10, shuffle to the kitchen in my bathrobe, and stare at the coffee maker as if it held the answers to questions I was afraid to ask. My wife would already be dressed and purposeful, tending her garden or preparing for her volunteer work at the hospital. The contrast between her energy and my lethargy was painful to witness. The rock bottom moment came during what should have been a joyful family visit. My grandson, now 16, had come to stay with us for a week during his spring break. I had been looking forward to his visit for months, imagining the conversations we would have, the activities we might share. Instead, I found myself struggling to connect with this young man who seemed to inhabit a completely different world from mine. On his third day with us, I was sitting in my usual spot on the living room couch, remote control in hand, flipping aimlessly through television channels. The morning talk shows blended into game shows. which dissolved into soap operas, which merged into afternoon news programs. I had perfected the art of watching television without actually seeing anything, a skill that would have horrified my younger self. My grandson sat down beside me, his laptop open, working on what appeared to be a school project. For a while, we existed in comfortable parallel silence. Then he closed the computer and looked at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of my son at that age. "Grandpa, you seem sad all the time now. Did I do something wrong?" Those words pierced through 8 years of denial and self-deception like a knife through paper. An 8-year-old child could see what I had been blind to for years. This boy, who should have been worried about homework and friends and teenage concerns, was instead worried about his grandfather's obvious unhappiness. I had become so absorbed in my own misery that I was projecting it onto the people I loved most. I tried to reassure him that he had done nothing wrong, but my voice cracked as I spoke. How could I explain to a 16-year-old that his grandfather had spent 8 years slowly dying while still breathing? How could I tell him that the man he once looked up to had become a cautionary tale about wasted potential? That night, after my grandson had gone to bed, I sat alone in my workshop, surrounded by tools I rarely used and projects I had never finished. The space that had once represented possibility and creativity now felt like a mausoleum of abandoned dreams. I forced myself to conduct the honest self-assessment I had been avoiding for years. I had destroyed meaningful relationships through a toxic combination of neglect and pride. My brother and I had not spoken in over 2 years, the result of a petty argument about a family gathering that had escalated because neither of us was willing to be the first to apologize. Former colleagues had stopped reaching out entirely after I repeatedly declined their invitations and failed to return their calls. I had convinced myself that maintaining distance was dignified, but really it was cowardice disguised as independence. I had become a prisoner of my past achievements instead of creating new ones. Every conversation became a nostalgic journey backward rather than an exploration forward. I could recite the details of projects completed decades ago, but had nothing meaningful to say about my current activities or future plans. I was like a broken record, stuck playing the same songs over and over while life moved on without me. My physical health had deteriorated in ways that were completely preventable. The diabetes diagnosis 2 years earlier should have been a wake-up call, but I had treated it like another inconvenience to manage rather than a symptom of deeper neglect. My back pain had worsened because I refused to do the exercises my physical therapist recommended. I ignored my doctor's warnings about my weight gain and blood pressure because facing those problems would require admitting how completely I had abandoned self-care. I had wasted thousands of hours on meaningless activities while convincing myself I was relaxing or taking well-deserved rest. The television had become my constant companion, an electronic babysitter that numbed my mind and consumed my days. I could tell you the plot of every daytime drama and the contestants on every game show, but I could not tell you the last time I had read a book, learned something new, or engaged in an activity that challenged or fulfilled me. Most damaging of all, I had failed to plan for this crucial phase of my life, with anything approaching the care I'd devoted to professional projects. I had planned every detail of my career, but treated retirement like it would plan itself. I expected fulfillment to arrive automatically, like a pension check, without any effort or intention on my part. Ask yourself this question, and please be honest in your answer. What will it take for you to change course? Don't wait for the crisis I waited for. I had survived a construction accident, but was dying from retirement, slowly, suffocating under the weight of my own wasted potential. The cost of my 8 years of denial was staggering when I finally calculated it. My marriage, though still intact, had become a shadow of its former partnership. My wife felt like she was living with a roommate rather than a husband. My relationships with my son and daughter had become superficial and strained. They called out of duty rather than desire, their conversations carefully avoiding topics that might trigger one of my nostalgic monologues or bitter complaints. My grandson's innocent question had accomplished what years of gentle suggestions and worried conversations had failed to achieve. It forced me to see myself through his eyes, and what I saw was heartbreaking. A once capable man had become a burden, a source of worry rather than wisdom, a cautionary tale rather than an inspiring example. I had survived a construction accident but was dying from retirement. The next morning, I woke up before my wife for the first time in years. I sat on the edge of our bed, watching her sleep peacefully, and made a promise that would change everything. I whispered to her sleeping form, "I've wasted 8 years of our retirement, but I won't waste another day." When she opened her eyes an hour later, she found me dressed, showered, and sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen, writing down everything I needed to change. The transformation did not happen overnight, but it began that very day. My first act of redemption was the most difficult, calling my brother to end our 2-year silence. My hands shook as I dialed his number, pride and stubbornness warring with desperate loneliness. When he answered, I simply said, "I'm sorry, and I miss talking to you." The relief in his voice told me he had been waiting for that call as much as I had been dreading making it. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end, we had planned a weekly coffee meeting that continues to this day. Rebuilding relationships required swallowing my pride repeatedly, but each successful reconnection gave me strength for the next one. I tracked down 3 former colleagues who had tried to maintain friendships after my retirement. My apology calls were awkward and painful, but 2 of the 3 men were willing to give me another chance. We started meeting monthly for lunch, and slowly I learned to ask about their lives instead of dominating conversations with stories about my past. The changes with my immediate family were the most rewarding and the most challenging. I had to learn how to talk to my son and daughter as the people they had become rather than the children I remembered. I started asking genuine questions about their work, their challenges, their dreams. Instead of offering unsolicited advice based on my engineering background, I listened and learned. My relationship with my wife transformed as I began treating her like a partner again, rather than an audience for my complaints. Addressing my obsession with past achievements required conscious effort every single day. I gave myself permission to mention work stories only once per conversation, and only if they were relevant to the discussion. I started reading current events, learning about technology, exploring subjects I had ignored during my career-focused years. I stopped being a former engineer and became a current learner. The physical restoration was perhaps the most concrete evidence of my transformation. I started with 15-minute walks around the neighborhood, gradually increasing the distance and pace. My wife joined me, and those daily walks became the foundation of our renewed partnership. We would talk about everything during those walks: plans for the day, memories worth sharing, dreams we had not discussed in years. The walking led to better eating habits, regular sleep schedules, and consistent medical care. My relationship with time changed completely. Instead of letting hours disappear into television static, I began structuring my days with purpose and intention. I created a schedule that balanced personal care, relationship maintenance, learning activities, and community service. Every hour became precious when I stopped treating them as unlimited resources. The community college where I began volunteering as a mentor gave me the sense of purpose I had been missing for 8 years. Working with young engineering students reminded me that my knowledge and experience still had value, but in a completely different context than my former career. I was not trying to reclaim my past identity, but creating a new one as an educator and guide. These students energized me with their questions, their enthusiasm, their fresh perspectives on problems I thought I understood completely. Learning new technology to connect with my grandson opened up worlds I had dismissed as irrelevant. Video calls, social media, online learning platforms became tools for maintaining relationships and continuing education rather than mysterious obstacles to avoid. My grandson became my teacher, patiently explaining concepts I had been too proud to admit I did not understand. Our relationship transformed from distant and awkward to engaged and mutually beneficial. The reading program at the local library gave me contact with children and families in my community. Watching young faces light up during story time reminded me that contribution and service could take forms I had never considered during my engineering career. I was using different skills, but still solving problems, still making things better, still adding value to the world around me. I started planning my retirement like I once planned construction projects, with purpose, milestones, and measurable outcomes. I created 5-year goals for my health, my relationships, my learning, and my service to others. Instead of drifting through days without direction, I had objectives that motivated me to get up each morning with energy and focus. Every day I wake up with a purpose and I go to bed with satisfaction. My morning routine includes exercise, breakfast conversation with my wife, and planning for meaningful activities. My evenings include reflection, gratitude, and preparation for tomorrow. The structure I once received from external work demands now comes from internal commitment to growth and service. My family tells me I'm more interesting now than I was during my career. My son seeks my advice not because I have all the answers, but because I have learned to listen before speaking. My daughter includes me in her important decisions because our conversations have become dialogues rather than monologues. My grandson enjoys spending time with me because I have learned to enter his world instead of demanding he enter mine. So I'm asking you, just as a grandfather would, learn from my 8 years of mistakes. Your retirement story is still being written. Plan for purpose, not just finances. Invest in relationships before you need them. Protect your health like the treasure it is. Use time intentionally rather than letting it slip away. Never stop growing, learning, and contributing. I can't recover those 8 years, but I refuse to waste another moment. Your retirement isn't the end of your story. It's the most important chapter you'll ever write. The best time to plan your meaningful retirement was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. What will you do differently because of my story?